one of the lawyers, the first execution I went to, one of the lawyers just said it was Kafka-esque, which of course seems kind of cliche, but it's totally true. I mean, there's a sign in there that at the front desk of the prison that says, can't have a good day with a bad attitude, and you can't have a bad day with a good attitude. Which I'm sure on like a normal day showing up for work might make sense, but right. It's weird, as an understatement.
This is Nashville Demystified. I am Alex Steed. Nashville Demystified is a show in which I get to know the city better by talking with the folks who live, work, agitate, and make art here. Today I talk with Steven Hale, a reporter for the Nashville Scene. Specifically, I talk with Hale about Tennessee's death penalty and his coverage of it. Nashville Demystified is made possible by Knack Factory, a video and content production house with office and production facilities here in the city, and by We Own This Town, a collection of podcasts produced by Nashvillians. I spoke of this one last week, but it's ongoing, and its second to last episode in the mini-series just came out. It is Chris Gaines, the podcast, where hosts Ashley Spurgeon and Michael Eads explore the misunderstood career of Chris Gaines, the Garth Brooks pop alter ego. This is great. This is really great. This is right up my alley, which is sort of, amateur critical analysis of tangential pieces of pop history. It's like the niche that I'm looking for all the time. So check it out. And two other quick things before I begin. One, I'm working with the storytelling event series Mortified to kick off an event here in Nashville. We'd really love for you to be a part of it. Go to getmortified.com, click participate, and when you submit, select Nashville as your city. I would love to see you there. The second is that Nashville Demystified released a zine. It's an old-fashioned black and white fold-in staple deal based on our David Berman episode. We're very close to having given them all away, and I imagine we're going to get pretty wiped out during this week, which is Americana Fest. But if you want one, find us on Twitter and Instagram, send your mailing address, and if we have any left, we'll send one your way. They're free. You just have to let us know that you want one. Finally, please find us on social. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and the wholly unnecessary 2011 remake of Footloose that is Facebook. Footloose. That 1984 classic about a boy from Chicago who moves to Utah and ensnares himself in the gritty underground world of playing chicken with tractors. Steven Hale is a journalist who lives here in Nashville. He's been in the city for nearly a decade. He's on staff with the Nashville Scene. He's been there for a few years. I think he's written for a bit longer, as he says in the interview. He dives into all this further, but he's been the witness to 3 state executions. He explains why covering the death penalty is important to him and how, contrary to how it might appear to anyone tuning in 2019, how Tennessee hasn't always been so enthusiastic about executions. This is sort of a new thing in 2019 into 2020, as you'll hear later, is sort of a big year for the revival of executions here in Tennessee. I don't have a ton to add to this introduction that I don't say in our conversation outside of the fact that literally the only element of, quote, culture shock I experience upon moving here early this year is what feels like regular use of capital punishment. You are sort of always reading about it or seeing some information about executions. I think because there are a lot that are happening right now. And it's just surreal to think about. Obviously, I knew that that capital punishment in general was a thing that existed in other states when I lived in a state that did not do that. But I don't know. I go into it further here about how it has affected me in one way or another, just seeing that the state is regularly doing this. And we talk a lot about what that means politically, what that means morally, and just like what it means logistically. So yeah, I was psyched to have Steven on this episode. I was psyched to have this conversation with him. It's not a conversation I thought I would be having for my fun-loving Nashville podcast, but here we are. And just so you have this, here's a super quick Wikipedia-fueled primer on capital punishment in Tennessee. In Tennessee, hanging was a legal method of execution until 1913, when executions were suspended for 2 years. And then 1915 comes around. The electric chair was introduced and used for 45 years. Between 1960 and 2000, the death penalty was not applied in the state. The death penalty was reinstated in 1975, but executions did not resume until 2000. With lethal injection that had become a legal method of execution at the end of the period. However, those sentenced to death before 1998 can request to be executed in the electric chair. Moreover, faced with difficulties in acquiring the drugs needed for lethal injections, Tennessee law was amended to once more permit electrocution as a backup method in case any problems with acquiring the drugs needed for lethal injections presented themselves. November 16th, 2018, as executions had resumed earlier that year after nearly a decade of hiatus, the Tennessee Supreme Court has set 6 execution dates between May 2019 and April 2020. Should these executions be carried out, neither be rescheduled or stayed, it would lead Tennessee to execute as many inmates in 1 year as it did in almost a 10-year hiatus. That is why, and this is me, Alex, talking, that is why it seems like things have ramped up, because they have. So there you have it. That is Tennessee's history with capital punishment. That is why it seems like it's everywhere right now. It is everywhere right now. And we're going to talk with Steven Hale about that. All right, everyone, let's talk with Steven.
So, Steven Hale, I'm a staff writer at the Nashville Scene. I've been full-time there for 7 years, a little over 7 years. I was freelancing for a couple years before that. I write news, a lot of criminal justice stuff and some politics and other stuff too. The Scene's a pretty small staff, so we all do a little bit of everything, but that's my main focus. So.
And I've seen you write about, so I didn't think about, I moved here from Portland, Maine.
Okay. I was going to ask where you came from. Yeah.
Yeah. I came from Portland, Maine, and there are few, so leaving from a northern state to move to a southern state, people have commentary about you doing that, right?
Sure.
And they're like, "Oh, are you ready for this? Are you ready for this?"
Right.
A lot of the preemptive stuff people were like, "Are you ready for?" were things that I actually haven't had any run-ins with or experiences one way or another. Usually, they're like, New England's a pretty, culturally atheistic. Are you ready for people to be, religious or very Christian,
sure.
That sort of thing. None of that has been an issue. One thing I wasn't ready for is the state as the death penalty and uses it.
Yeah, well, that's a relatively new, not new for the state to have the death penalty, but new for it to be using it again.
So what's happening?
So it's a fair question. So last year, a little over a year ago, August 2018, the state executed a prisoner for the first time in almost a decade, the state had been trying to for some time. In fact, Billy Ray Irick, who was executed last year, that first execution, he had been scheduled a few years before. In 2014, he was scheduled to die. It was actually a little strange because I was scheduled to witness that execution and it got called off. A lot of that had to do with just legal fights over the lethal injection drugs and just a number of other kind of legal back and forth sort of things. But it had been a while. And so now Tennessee, while executions keep going down nationwide, like as a total, Tennessee is now reviving its death penalty and is one of a small handful of states who, still executing people. I mean, this year, I think I'm right in saying 4 or 5 states have executed someone, maybe could be, Texas does it a lot. But, we're in a small club now. So... Why is that? Like, why is it newly? Well, I mean, the best answer I have on that is that the folks in charge around here, are intent on doing it. this was an issue in the Supreme Court. We have elected Supreme Court justices, and it became an issue in the Supreme Court race a few years back because the lieutenant governor at the time was sort of intimating that these justices hadn't been scheduling executions, had sort of been letting these guys sit on death row without scheduling their executions, and these cases were dragging on. And so yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we have this weird thing where we have these governors, the past two governors who have spoken quite a bit about their Christian faith, and even Bill Lee, our governor now, has been involved in prison ministry and talks a lot about rehabilitation and has talked a lot about criminal justice reform, but has signed off on 2 executions now. So I don't have a great answer on that, to be honest with you. I mean, I suspect that a lot of the state's politicians just assume, rightly, I guess, that the public is still behind them on it.
Right, right. You're right, because if they weren't, there'd be.
I guess, yeah, that's kind of and so now we've had five in a year, or a little more than a year. There's one more this year. So,
and you have witnessed
3 of them.
3 of them. Can you just tell me why journalists witness executions?
Yeah, no, it's a really fair question, and it's one I've gotten a lot because when you tell someone you're going to do that, it's not a normal assignment.
Right.
I mean, I guess I have 2 answers. One being just sort of why I did it, why it mattered to me, and then one generally. I mean, the general answer is that when they execute a prisoner, they do it in a room in the middle of the prison, and it's the state on behalf of the public executing a person and killing them. And so, I mean, just sort of the general answer for why journalists go there is for transparency's sake, you know, so that the state, the state has protocols and laws about how they do this, how they carry out an execution, and journalists being there allow someone to see that they're following that they're doing what they say they're going to do, that they're not, breaking the law or breaking their own protocols, and just to kind of be able to come out and tell the people this is what it was like, this is what they did, right. Because without that, I mean, you've probably seen this. I mean, after they do an execution, the announcement the state puts out is like 2 sentences. They just say the death sentence was carried out, time of death was this. Right. They don't tell you anything, and that's become particularly important recently with all of the legal fights over these methods and lethal injection drugs, because you have journalists who come out and say, this person was making this noise, this person was choking, they were moving when they weren't supposed to be, or that kind of thing. And so that has become important in those legal fights about what drugs they use.
Right.
For me, I've always cared about the death penalty, and it's something I've been interested in and felt strongly about. And then as a reporter started writing on it, and there's not a lot of transparency around the death penalty. States do not tell the public a lot about how they're doing, what they're doing, and from where they get lethal injection drugs to a number of other issues. And so, as someone who's always banging on about how there needs to be more transparency, and who I've always kind of felt like if the state is going to kill someone, I insist that they let citizens watch them do it. They can't do it in secret. And so I felt like if I'm going to say that I was in a position to be one of those witnesses, that I needed to do it. Certainly not looking to set any records for the most of them that I've seen or anything like that, but I did feel like it was important to bear witness to it. So I hope that answers your question. No, yeah, that's kind of
it does. I'm actually sort of speaks to a cynicism I'm not psyched that I have, but I'm sort of surprised that journalists are still allowed to. I realize that it probably causes more problems than not if a journalist is not allowed.
Yeah. I mean, I think. Yeah, I mean, I know where that cynicism comes from, though. I mean, the prison system in particular, is just not. Telling you what's going on is not the top of their priority list, for sure. They're not that interested in that. I mean, they do it because they have to. But so yeah, I think that cynicism may be unfortunate, but it's warranted, I think. But yeah, I mean, for the time being, law says there has to be 7 media witnesses there, or at least spots for 7. I suppose if there weren't enough people who were volunteering, that'd be different. But there are 7 spots for media witnesses and the executions, and of course lawyers and things are there too. But what was your position before you had gone in as a witness, and how has both writing, I mean, not just exclusively being a witness, but how is writing about the subject and having witness executions, either changed or intensified or shifted where you were at? I've always been opposed to the death penalty. I think for a long time, that was just sort of for the more basic reasons you would imagine, that killing someone as a punishment for killing someone doesn't make sense or doesn't feel morally right or that sort of thing. The way that it's reporting on this, first, just setting aside witnessing the executions for a moment, I mean, reporting on these cases has deepened my understanding of just how arbitrary the death penalty is. And by that I mean that if you commit one crime in County A in year B, you might get the death penalty. If you commit that same crime in County C in year D, you won't. Right. In this state today, there's a lot of, Shelby County sentences people to death. There hasn't been someone sentenced to death in Nashville in quite a while. The number of jurisdictions that still hand down death sentences is decreasing. So we have this punishment that is supposedly for the worst of the worst, but that's not how it gets handed out. It gets handed out depending on where you do what. And the men who have been executed in our state in the past year, their cases have shown that. Ed Zagorski, who was executed in last year, he was the second man executed in 2018. He was convicted and sentenced to death for a double murder during a large drug deal. And, as with all these cases, the actual details of what both sides argued happened there are complicated, but that's what he was convicted of. And his lawyers argued throughout, the years that they were fighting this case, they pointed out that there are, a number of people convicted of killing more people during a drug-related homicide than that who did not get the death penalty.
Right.
It just there are guys in Tennessee prisons who have killed 5 people during a drug deal and don't have the death penalty, weren't sentenced to death. So it becomes hard to really see how you can say, well, it's the worst of the worst, when it's just not. It's just sort of plainly not. And one piece of that Tennessee has not really had to confront yet, because the only men executed here so far in the past year have been white men, is that the racial statistics of the death penalty are appalling as well. I mean, Tennessee's death row is disproportionately black. Again, you wouldn't necessarily maybe think that if you're watching the news and you keep seeing these white guys being executed, but the numbers suggest that the death penalty is racist in a number of ways. I mean, whether it's black men being sentenced to death or the fact that a lot of times the race of the victim comes into play. If you, broadly speaking, we, have punished people more harshly for killing white people than for killing black people. That's all stuff that just when you get into these case files and you're covering these cases, you start reading through all this information you see. I mean, the other thing, though, that it's probably changed my life, is just reading through these men's personal histories, their backgrounds, the abuse they suffered as children. 5 men have been executed here in a little more than a year. They all have either childhood abuse, mental illness, or both in their background, sexual abuse, abuse by parents or families. I mean, it's just horrific stuff. And it's not to excuse killing someone, of course, or raping someone or anything like that, but it is a is context that, you know, for me, when as a reporter, but also just as a human reading through these things, I know the childhood I had, and I was very lucky. My parents did not abuse me. They, you know, had very loving parents who were able to provide for me. I didn't struggle with poverty or debilitating mental illness or any of those things by no control of my own, right? I mean, you know, just lucky, or, you know. But I just think, switch me out with this guy. Billy Ray Irick was first put in a mental institution when he was 6 years old. You know, give me his life, and I don't know how it would have turned out.
Right.
You know, I don't know if would I have committed the crime he committed. I don't know, but I mean, it's hard to read those stories and think, oh, well, the only issue here is that this person is just morally inferior to me. Mm-hmm. You know, there's a lot of other inputs, I guess, if that makes sense, that you start to realize. And so that's the thing that I really haven't been able to shake in covering these cases. It's just that, and that's true of people in the prison system broadly, too, not just on death row, but it sort of gets heightened, of course, when it's the people that we're executing.
I've been surprised, I think, by the thing that's surprising to me walking into this place in 6 months is just how frequently I hear of the death penalty. And it's probably like in the lead up, there's like a lead up when someone is going to get executed. Right. Someone gets executed, there's like information. Then there's like maybe an appeal. Like in the past, it seems like in the past couple of days, there were advancements with a specific sort of an appeal.
Right.
So it's back in the news, and just like, I never thought about how psychologically fascinating that is that it's like, if you're in a place where constantly you're being reminded that if the state really wants to, they can kill you. Like,
yeah, well, so that's interesting, because I was gonna ask you, coming from, how long did you live in Maine?
Oh, on and off forever.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, if you don't mind me asking,
no.
What was your level of like awareness of the death penalty, just living
the last
kind of growing up or whatever, you know?
The last time, oh God, who was executed? It was like one of the famous serial killers in like March of '94 was killed in Florida.
Yeah.
And I was at Disney World when that happened. And I remember we were driving and I listened to a radio, and I was, 10, and I just like heard the countdown, and, I was like, oh, okay, like this is a thing that happens. And that's the last coverage I heard of the death penalty. Like it almost feels like a dream, And so I'm absolutely well aware that people are executed in particular states. I'm actually absolutely well aware that Texas is one of the states that I heard on a regular basis. Very similar conclusions about the logic of states doing this, particularly the moral logic, if not just like the logic. But I never thought of like the reality of what it's like to be around that.
Yeah.
And I know like a good friend of mine, Sarah Marshall, has a podcast called You're Wrong About, and during our whole friendship, she was writing about the Ted Bundy case. It all got turned into like a 20,000 word piece for The Believer. And so I'm very intimately aware of how the death penalty sort of played into that and like what happened around that circus. And that's it. It sort of blips in and out, and like almost pop culture. And then to be in a place where that is where it's sort of like regularly a part of the news. I haven't fully thought about what that means to me. But it is interesting to be reminded,
for sure,
that it's there. Like, and I already know that, like, as you said, I mean, the like prison system in particular ways is already sort of an institution that needs some work. And I got that.
Artfully put.
Yeah, and I got that many people, particularly people of color, are getting the wrong end of the stick in that system.
Right.
But then when when you come to a place and it's like there's sort of a constant, especially, and I know that you read about politics. I know that you're a journalist. I don't at all want to put you in a weird situation, have to speak to anything.
Not at all.
But especially in a place, in any state is like this, where the politicians, especially the conservative politicians, seem to be extraordinarily corrupt about the way they go about their business.
It does seem that way. Yeah, well, it's interesting what you say about the way that it's a blip, kind of like, there's a lot of coverage and then it goes away. There's a lot of coverage and it goes away. I'm sure you're experiencing kind of a interesting version of it from moving here right as the state is like restarting this execution. But
you're saying it wasn't like this for years.
No, yeah, it was. I mean, just because there were no scheduled executions, so there was no like, and that, in some ways that's probably an indictment of the media, in that these cases are still worth covering even before someone's name is on the calendar.
Sure. But
obviously that heightens the focus on it. But it is interesting to me because the weird thing about these guys on death row is, they're locked away from society, and I don't just mean in the sense that they're in a prison, but even more so than regular prisoners. I mean, the media access to death row has been restricted greatly in recent years, and so there were times where you might be able to watch an interview with a death row prisoner on TV,
right?
And so now, you're seeing a guy's face, he's talking, you're hearing his voice. Now if I write a story on one of them, I do my best to reach out to people, their lawyers and stuff, see can we get pictures that aren't just mugshots. And it's not about being sympathetic, but it is about humanizing the person, because regardless of what you think of them or what they did, it's like, this is a human being and here's they are. And people in prison are reduced to their mugshot and their crime often. And that's like especially so with men. And I say men, there's only one woman on Tennessee's death row. It's mostly men. On death row you don't have interaction with them. They're not. So then when the execution comes up, like you're saying, the coverage starts heating up. It's this. I mean, I know what it's like for me to try to inhale all the information about these cases. I can only imagine being just someone in the public who's not obsessing over it. And that's not a judgment. They're living their lives, and then they pick up the news, they're trying to be informed, and then they're having to try to take in all this information about this person and this case and this horrible crime that they did. They probably have never heard of this person, or so it's like, it's easy to see why it can persist, because people aren't made to confront it very often. And we can't empathize with people that we don't see or aren't around. We can't even begin to, it's like, it's not really, I'm rambling now, but does that make sense? Like,
it does make sense.
It's easy for the public to just sort of not think about it, because why would you? It's,
and you just blip when it's going to happen.
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of people, very thoughtful people, watch the coverage, they read stories or whatever, and they think about it. They're like, oh, this is complicated for these reasons, but then it goes on, and so it's like this weird issue that that is like that.
Well, it's interesting the way that you put it, and we've seen that happen across the board in the past 25 years about everything. I mean, like what access there is to war, what access there is to
right.
And so, and to the point where your mental math or ethical math is reduced to a very black and white picture. It's like someone was executed. Well, I saw the crimes, thank God they're not around anymore, right? And not actually having to think about the fact, well, like I helped subsidize someone getting murdered, which is like a
it's a much more complicated sort of thought process. And I think you're exactly right about the like war reporting. I mean, that's obviously quite different from the reporter's point of view. I mean, the experience of covering military combat is not one I've had. But in terms of the importance of it, I mean, you were asking me earlier about why journalists cover the executions. I do think there's a parallel there in the sense that, I remember some of my first memories of watching, actually, this is an interesting thing I hadn't thought of, but I mean, the first execution I can remember is Timothy McVeigh's execution. Mm-hmm. And I don't remember a whole lot of the coverage other than hearing that he had been executed by lethal injection. And I remember seeing his face because they were showing his face a lot on TV, And, I guess it was probably around the same time I remember, coverage of military conflicts. I mean, I remember watching when we invaded Iraq on TV and stuff, and there's this CNN shot of bombs falling and things, And as an adult, I've since now read on the ground reporting. People have written books about who reported from there and things. Right. And I have a much better understanding of what war is like. Best I can have without having been there, obviously. And that makes a huge difference in my life. And to me, the executions are a version of that in which, like, I don't think you can really fully understand it, what it means to kill someone, right, regardless of what they've done, unless you see it. And my job, whether it's an execution or a city council meeting or whatever is to help you see something that you weren't there to see.
It must make city council meetings real weird.
Well, I mean, yes, although those things can be
sure
interminable. So
the Timothy McVeigh one is actually, it's interesting. That's the one that I think shaped my opinion.
Interesting.
And for a number of reasons. One is I have no sympathy for Timothy McVeigh. However, I was raised around a lot of people who were a lot like Timothy McVeigh.
Really,
the guy he I forget his protege's name, not his protege, but the guy he was with. He had traces to Maine and was sort of around Maine and reminded me of a lot of guys that I knew. And like it wasn't that alone, but it was that mixed with the Onion headline after he died, which was "All is better now in Oklahoma City."
Right.
And I was like, boom.
Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Timothy McVeigh's death by lethal injection Monday has made everything perfect in Oklahoma City. His 168 victims' loved ones describing themselves as feeling 100% better. I just know my baby girl is up there in heaven, smiling down on this execution happy as can be, said a beaming George Brown, whose 7-year-old daughter Brianna died in the 1995 Federal Building blast. Her death is avenged and everything's great, said Oklahoma City schoolteacher Sherry Olsacker, 37, who was blinded in the bombing. You can't imagine how healing this is. My eyesight's even returned. Moments after McVeigh was pronounced dead, 168 white doves were seen soaring over the city, racing toward a suddenly cloudless horizon that beckoned the dawn of a glorious new day. Everything better now in Oklahoma City. June 13th, 2001. The Onion.
Savage headline, but that's why the Onion is genius. Because that's a great point, and I'm glad you said that about you have no sympathy for Timothy McVeigh. I mean, neither do I.
Sure.
But I think it's a really important point because the thing I get a lot when I write these stories, a lot of times they're focused on when an execution is coming up, I'm writing about the man who's going to be executed, his case. What is this guy like? What does he say? What crime did he commit, but what has he been like? I'm just trying to find out as much as I can about them. And so a lot of times I will get emails or messages, people say like, why are we, why are you shedding tears over this guy, or why are we spending so much time sympathizing with this guy, or whatever the way they put it is. And to me, it's not about sympathy. I mean, I do, as a side note, I do actually have sympathy for some of these men, because they did a horrific thing, and in many cases they're essentially a different person now. This is 30 years ago, and I think it's worth considering, even though most of us thankfully have not committed a murder. I think it's worth considering what it would be like to be reduced to the worst thing you've ever done. So I do actually have sympathy for them. I have sympathy for the way that they're going to be killed and what it must be like to walk into a room knowing that you're going to be killed. But I say all that as a side note because when I'm doing my job, it's not about sympathy. I'm not motivated by sympathy.
Right.
I'm motivated by, this is a human being that we're about to do this to, we the state, and as you pointed out, we the taxpayers who are paying for this, and it's our representatives who are doing it.
Right, I have a bad enough job if I'm in Maine and there's a bad plow job that I help pay for. Like,
right, yeah, it's frustrating.
The second we're doing wild shit like this.
Totally. And so not to go off on a long tangent, but it's important, I think, to know it's not about sympathy. Sure. And I do think it's crucial to remember the victims and to write about them too and to humanize them too, because they've also been reduced to the worst moment of their life. Obviously the victims who are dead, but their families and stuff. But it's just to say that it's about trying to make us confront the totality of what we're dealing with here. Right. This isn't just a cartoon villain that we're now going to erase. It's a human being who is going to experience this thing. And listen, my inbox is proof that there are a lot of people who are still just fine with that.
Sure.
But if we're going to do it, I think we ought to at least look it in the face.
Well, and I know what you mean. I mean, in the thing that, Sarah Marshall, who I was talking about earlier, the thing that she and I talked about for a long time, the thing she writes about is that the problem with reducing people, especially to like evil or to sort of this untouchable place, is we don't see the themness in us,
Right.
or we don't see the piece of them that we helped create, and not specifically individually helped create, but we culturally
Society,
helped create.
yeah, exactly.
And similarly, I mean, it's like, you know, if I can't imagine a better era of being reminded of the dangers of only calling people wearing pointy hoods racist, right? Or having racist ideas,
Mm-hmm.
right? And because, I mean, you know, that was our standard for a long time, and let's see where we are right now. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I do think, I think one of the biggest dangers in sort of being, you know, reductivist in any way around sort of the people who we're talking about is we don't leave room any possibility of seeing how to fix it or how to make it better or how to not make people who do these things.
Right. Yeah. Well, again, that Onion headline you quoted.
Right.
I mean, yeah, there's just so many ways that you can look at something like the death penalty from, one of them being that we don't really have any reason to believe it's a deterrent.
Right.
So just as strictly speaking, as sort of a practical matter, it's like, you know, what's the point of doing this? You know, we know it costs more by the time you actually execute someone, the state has spent more money than if they just sentence them to life in prison or whatever.
Sure.
There are a lot of victims and victims' families who oppose these executions. Not all, for sure. I mean, I certainly don't speak for them, but there are plenty of them who say, you know, I don't need that to happen. You know. You mentioned the Abu Ali Abdurrahman's case, who's the one that's been in the news here recently. You know, this is a great example of how we shouldn't just generalize. We got to just take it all in and look at it for what it is. So he participated in this a murder during a robbery and that left one person dead and a woman stabbed but alive. Her 2 children were there. They were in court the other day. You know, when he was in court, I saw them sitting there in the front row crying. You know, that was good for me to confront. Sure. I write a lot about these guys on death row. It's good to see there's the person who's been affected by what this person did, and they're still affected by it. The son of I think I'm right in saying it was his son of the man who was killed, told the DA, Glenn Funk, I still want to, you know, burn his ass. Like, this guy should still be executed. The woman who was stabbed but lived, according to the district attorney, said she's forgiven him and doesn't need to see him executed. Her daughter said, you know, it's not like we're hell-bent on seeing him executed. We don't want him to get out of prison, though, because he did this horrible thing. So it's like there's a whole spectrum of that.
Sure.
But again, it's worth confronting that and not reducing any of those people to caricatures.
Right.
But I also
anyone who in that whole
lineup
of people
exactly,
you just talked about.
Exactly. Yeah. Just and then you know, we can deal with it on the other end if we honestly do that. But so yeah, for me, it's like that's the biggest motivating factor to covering these cases and witnessing the executions is just, you know, to try to put that out there, I guess.
So walk us through just like what when you go and you not a spectator, what are you
witness
when you're a witness, excuse me, just walk us through walking through the doors.
Sure.
and get us to the end of the night.
Yeah, so, you know, on these on the days there's executions, there's obviously a lot of extra security at the prison. Show up before you enter the prison property. They stop you there. They kind of, you know, if you're a reporter, one of the media communications people is there to kind of check you in and give you a name tag and things. And they check your car. They've got some dogs out there and stuff like that. There's this is a side note from what you're asking, but there's a separate, they kind of direct people who follow the news on the nights of these executions will see the pictures of the vigils that the folks hold outside the prison. There's kind of a designated area it's very strange. You go over there and it's 2 fenced off areas. One says for the death penalty, one says against, you know, and it's just, it's just a strange scene. You know, They got a tent set up in the parking lot, which is where the media will hold a press conference afterwards. And I've talked to prisoners who from the prison see that tent and they all know they know what that means, which I can't imagine what that must be like to be inside the prison and know, and you know, just so alienating. I can imagine. Anyway, so you get in, and they lead you into the prison. These executions are scheduled for like 7, and they lead you in there about 5:20, something like that. So it's kind of a long, slow process. They take you in, and the security at the Riverbend at the prison it's like going through a small airport. You take off your belt, your shoes, go through the metal detector, a couple scanners, that kind of thing. It's a very strange scene when you're going in there for an execution, because it's just one of the lawyers, the first execution I went to, one of the lawyers just said it was Kafka-esque, which of course seems kind of cliche, but it's totally true. I mean, there's a sign in there that at the front desk of the prison that says, can't have a good day with a bad attitude, and you can't have a bad day with a good attitude.
Jesus.
Which I'm sure on like a normal day showing up for work might make sense, but it's weird, as an understatement. When you're walking there for an execution, you see that, you're going through security. Everyone's being kind of nice. I mean, I haven't had negative interactions with the prison staff, but in a strange way, it feels wrong to have a normal interaction with a person on a night like that. You walk in and they say, "Oh, how are you doing?" And you're like, "Well, they offer you coffee. Right. Feel weird about taking the coffee. I'm going to sit here and have coffee before an execution. Well, I got to work tonight, so I have the coffee." It's like it's just everything's upside down. The first execution I went to, and me and all the other reporters commented on this, the front lobby, I guess you'd call it, of the prison was just like thick with the smell of fresh paint. And they had freshly painted the lobby because it's a big night, everyone's going to be coming in there and see. It's just strange. So yeah, they bring you in there. We bring you to a conference room where you kind of sit and wait. You got to wait for a while, largely because there are a couple different groups of people there to see an execution. In theory, there might be family members of the victim, and they're separate from the media, which I think makes sense. I mean, it's normally my job to want to talk to everyone, but I think in those circumstances, it makes sense that they don't make the victim's family members walk around with a bunch of reporters. Yeah. So they keep them separate, and they hold you in a conference room while they're moving around. Maybe this is like way too much detail that you're asking about, but they, like I said, they bring you some state government coffee, and at a certain point come in with, anyone who's visited a prison will be familiar with this, but I mean you can't bring anything in there. On a normal night, much less when there's an execution. You can't have your phone. Most of the time, they won't let you have a watch. I think sometimes, maybe if it's like jewelry in a sense, they'll let you keep. But I can't bring a notebook. So when you get in there, they give you a notepad and 2 pencils, which again is like a really weird feeling because they're facilitating you doing your job, but it's just weird to be handed a notepad, to have a state employee come in and say, "Oh, here you go. It's in a Ziploc bag. It's a notepad and 2 pencils," and you know that they're giving you this so that you can take notes while they kill a person. Right. It's just like all these. To me, the people always ask me what it's like to witness an execution. It's all the little details that are haunting to me. It's just like little things that are so strange when you're outside of the context once you think about them. So you sit in there for a little bit. And then they come and get you and kind of take you back toward where the execution chamber is. And at Riverbend, that means walking outside and then walking through 2 large fences. There are 2 gates through barbed wire fences, which for me, that's the section of the prison that's always kind of like, there's the moment that it hits you, I'm in a maximum security prison and not an airport, bring you in there. And one kind of grim feature of the Riverbend layout is that the execution chamber is basically adjacent to a large visitation gallery. So when people come and visit their family members who are incarcerated or something, there's kind of a large open room. They can sit at tables. I don't know if they know this when they visit, but one of the doors in that room leads to the execution chamber. So, they bring you in there, and then this is by now it's about 6:30 or so. And I don't actually know why this is, but they turn the lights off when you get in there. I get why the lights are off later because they want you to be able to see and they don't want the lights on in there. But it's just weird. So the 3 times I've done that, I've sat in the dark in that room for 10, 15, 20 minutes before. And typically it's like I said, it's 7 media witnesses, usually the attorney for the person who's being executed, an attorney from the state, and then a couple corrections staff. And this is the other thing that I feel like, we can never forget. You mentioned it earlier, is that prison staff are being asked to do this too. So, a communications staff member is sort of escorting the media around and sits there for the execution. There's another person who accompanies the media everywhere they go, and it's for sort of security reasons. So you got all these other staff members who have to participate in this as well. And then, around, it depends the timing on everything, but shortly after that, they open the curtain. And so you're in this room, and there's kind of a large window in front of you with a few frames, and you're looking into this like really brightly lit execution chamber. And, depending on the method, you're either looking at a guy on a gurney or a guy in an electric chair already, sitting there in the chair. And one really strange thing about that is about when you first come into that viewing gallery is like you can hear what's going on in there. So like I remember I've witnessed 1 lethal injection and 2 electrocutions. So I remember Billy Ray Irick's execution, which was a lethal injection. I mean, we could hear what I presumed were the wheels of the gurney squeaking when they brought him in. He was on the gurney and they wheeled him. In the case of an electrocution, there's these buckets that have saline solution that they soak the sponges in to conduct the electricity. And again, getting back to what I said about those little details, there's the things that stick with me for whatever reason. But I mean, I remember both times hearing, that sound of one of those Home Depot buckets. You drop the handle and it goes bounces off of it. That sound, echoing in from the execution chamber into where we're sitting. It's just little things like that. You're just sitting there in the dark, like hearing these things, and it's, I don't know, it's very kind of haunting. But yeah, then they open the curtain and they get on with it. But and there's a guy I think a lot about is the Riverbend warden, Tony Mays. He is in the chamber for the executions, whether it's a lethal injection or an electrocution. I can't imagine what that's like. And he knows these guys on a first name basis. It's not like, he works at the prison. He goes in there, he goes in there to get them when it's time. So yeah.
When it happens, when the person's executed, what's the overall tone after? Like what happens?
Well, I mean, when it's happening, and this is a blessing in a way, in a selfish sense, which is that in the moment as a reporter, you're just so focused on, I have to take good notes. I have to be able to tell people what happened. Mm-hmm. So you're watching everything, trying to write it down and trying to make sure you don't miss anything, what time everything's happening, what the person's body's doing, what sounds are they making, all that kind of stuff. So it's not that it's distracting, but this hyper focus that actually, I think, kind of gets you through it in a way. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like, so the tone is just everyone's quiet and just scribbling, basically. Afterwards, I mean, in my experience, the other reporters that I've witnessed executions with have been completely professional and really helpful. I mean, I don't think you can. It's extremely helpful on a hard night like that to be with other reporters because you're essentially all working together. I mean, everyone's taking their own notes. You're all taking your own observations, but afterwards, it's. Oh, let me make sure I got his last words. What did we all hear that correctly? And what that kind of thing. Just because you're operating as a pool, so when you come out, you're all together going to tell everyone what happened. So we're trying to make sure that everyone got it right, and that we, so that's, the tone is always very serious and kind of focused, I guess.
So you have something to do, right?
Right.
Like, whereas like if you just had to like go and get into your car, that would be probably...
Right. I mean, I am not used to being, the topic is difficult, but this is enjoyable. Sitting here with you, I could do this. But I'm not a TV reporter.
Right.
So I'm not used to, like, when you come out of that prison, you stand there in front of a bunch of cameras and give a press conference. I mean, it's always funny there's always a few TV reporters who are witnesses as well. And of course they're great at that. They get up and they're just sort of very composed and they just state everything in these perfect sentences. And I'm up there sort of stammering, looking through my notes, like, it's, so that, and it's a hard moment to try to sort of like condense what you just saw right after you saw it. That's a difficult task. Mm-hmm. But to your point, it also, you're in the mode of like, I have to try to do this well, try to be clear, try to explain what's going on. And then they're all like, all right, get out. I mean, they basically say, okay, you got an hour to like get your trucks and all your TV stuff off the property because it's still a prison, Right. And then, that's always a weird night just personally because, like I said, I think I mentioned to you earlier, I mean, I have 2 young kids and married, and I, coming home from a thing like that and walking in the door and it's like, there's my wife eating dinner or watching TV. It's like just a weird thing to sort of like drop back into your normal life after that.
Right, that's the only thing I could think about the entire time you were talking about that, is that you have a wife and 2 kids. Yeah,
it's, and I mean, they're young. It's not like I have to talk to them about this. I just say, like, I have to work tonight. They're 4 and 1. They don't, so I'm spared that sort of difficult, like, well, what are you doing? But yeah, it's just strange, and like I said, I think a lot about all the other people involved in that process and what that must be like for them. I mean, it's helpful to me that I feel a clarity of purpose, kind of. Mm-hmm. I don't feel guilty about having been there for the most part. I mean, there is a weird aspect to it that, and this really hit me more like the second time and then this most recent execution, the third one I'd witnessed, that you do kind of feel like part of a production. Mm-hmm. And I think it's an important role to play, but you're still like, you're going where they're going. Usually as a reporter, you're going into a situation and maybe you've been granted access or they've let you in or whatever, but usually you're trying to be independent in the sense of like, just whatever I see here, I'm going to go where I want to go. I'm going to get the info I need, whether you want me to get it or not. Mm-hmm. I'm not trying to sound like some kind of, badass or whatever, but that's just your job. You're trying to like disrupt. You're not trying to just go along with what the people in charge will let you do. You're trying to find out more if you can or do more if you can. When you show up at a maximum security prison and to witness an execution, you can't be like, I'm going to wander off into this room and sit. Like they take you to the rooms they want you to go, and then they walk you out, and then they tell you to leave. And so you do sort of feel like part of it in a way. And I don't regret it. I don't feel like conflicted about the importance of doing it, but it is a weird feeling because of that.
What do you think is it sounds like you get asked about this a lot. What is the thing that you find surprises people the most about when you recount sort of what happens or what the evening is like?
That's a good question. I mean, a lot of people recently that I talked to are just shocked that we are still using the electric chair. Yeah. Just on a basic level, because it just sounds, people think it sounds kind of like medieval's not the right word because it has electricity, but you know what I mean? It just sounds
very much like from the 20th century.
Yeah, it just sounds kind of, it's wild that the thing still exists. And so that seems to strike people a lot. I mean, I think the mundane parts of it, I mentioned that sign to you, and you had the same reaction that everyone had, which it's this weird, one piece I wrote about one of these executions, I said the experience was like a mashup of bureaucracy and barbarism. It's like this weird, some of it is just so boring and normal, and then you're like, oh, but you're here for an execution. You know, it's like so those are the things that are always strange to me, and that I feel like always strike people as weird. And that gets to a larger thing, which is just the way that we carry these out are, you know, I think there's plenty of ugliness associated with kind of public executions, obviously. The Old West idea of like, we're going to walk this guy to the gallows and hang him in front of a crowd. Mm-hmm. We obviously in America and in the South in this state have a horrible history of lynching that is not separate from this. So of course I'm not saying that's doing it that way is the way that is better or something. I mean, there's a whole laundry list of reasons that that's horrifying. But there's a weird shift in the move from like, hey, this, you know, the idea of this person's going to hang in the city streets or whatever, to we're going to do this in a private room in the prison, and with any luck, not many people will hear or think about it.
Right.
And that's, you know, that's kind of a weird thing. And all those mundane aspects of the night make me think of that, where it's like we've really done everything we can to make this just a kind of, you know, ho-hum ordeal. I mean, that's lethal injection, right? It's like, can we make an execution look like a medical procedure?
Right.
I mean, the answer is no. Not just, I say that not just as someone who's seen it, but, you know, all you have to do is read about the horror shows that have resulted from these drugs that we use to execute people, and you can see that it hasn't been quite so simple. But
how are you doing?
I'm all right. I mean, I have a good therapist at the insistence of a lot of people in my life.
This is my plug that I tell everyone, say every time someone brings up a therapist, is for everyone to go to therapy. I
am on that train. I've offered to pay for people that I hardly know before, and it's not a judgment. It's just everyone should go. By the way, I went to one before I ever witnessed an execution. So yes, go to one and do not feel any shame about it. But I mean, in all seriousness, yes, that's part of it. I do, you know, I wasn't really, I said this after the recent execution, and, you know, I do think that I'll take a break from seeing these. I think it's really important. I think someone needs to do it, and I hate something about saying, like, someone needs to do that and not doing it doesn't feel quite right, but I do think that it definitely wears on you, you know. You know, this recent one has stuck with me, I think, a little more than, I don't know if there's some kind of amplifying effect or something, you know, but I do think it's a secondary trauma in a way, and I'm not trying to make myself the victim. I mean, I chose to be there, and I think it's important to be there, but I also think it's important to be honest about how difficult it is to see, because that, again, I think we got to confront what we're actually doing. So it's like, and that's another weird thing about covering these as a journalist. You know, usually our job is not to put ourselves in the story and to just report what we see. And my job's a little different. You know, working for the Scene, we write, it's a little more magazine style, or a little more, you know, we can be a little more creative in that sense with stories. And so I have a little more leeway there, as opposed to if I were writing for a wire service, you know, where it's much more like, you know, trying to provide the bullet point facts of things. But with things like this, with covering executions, I mean, in writing about them and in talking about them, I've just never felt like I could talk about them honestly without doing it in the first person, you know? It's like, you're in the room. How can you pretend that you're not, you know?
Right.
So, and that's helpful. I mean, you asked how I'm doing. I mean, it's writing about these. Oddly, I have, throughout my career, I've like struggled with anxiety about writing, and I've had hard times before, like sitting there looking at the blank screen, you know, like everyone probably does sometimes. These things have always come out pretty quick after these executions, and I think it's just, there's a catharsis to it of just like, you know, writing out what it was like. So I think that's actually been helpful in a weird kind of way. I have a lot of people be like, man, I'm sorry that you had to do that, and then you had to work, you know, to get up the next day and write about it. I'm like, you know, to me that's like better than just walking around doing something else and thinking about it, you know, so.
Right.
So, yeah.
So like typically typically in an interview, like I usually ask someone like intensively about like what they do and how they do whatever.
Yeah,
and
sure.
I'm like, what's your favorite thing about Nashville? Which feels gauche right now, but
it's okay. I mean, that's all right. We gotta. I mean, look, after these things, you still gotta go out to restaurants.
Yeah.
You still gotta live. But.
What do you enjoy, having been here
Yeah.
for 10 years or just about 10 years, a little under? What do you enjoy most about being here?
So I think my answer to this is, well, personally, I had the weird, I think somewhat unique experience of moving up here with a bunch of my closest friends from college and from before, just by a strange series of events. Like I've ended up here with a bunch of people I was already very close with. And so, it could have been here, it could have been anywhere. And if that whole group was there, I would have felt like, okay, I've got my community here. I'm kind of set. So that just as on a personal level is like influenced my experience being here. I mean, in terms of it being Nashville, my life right now doesn't lead to me like going out to a lot of like bars at night and checking out musicians or bands or whatever, but I do still love just being adjacent to all that. I'm really lucky because working at the Scene, I'm always coming in and hearing our music editor or our editor or someone else in the office talking about a new band I need to check out, or I read the Scene and I read about a new, so I get to be close to that stuff, and that's fun. And I just love living in a place where I know there's that kind of vibrant scene going on.
Yeah.
Of course, it's kind of crashing up against like this growth that is making it harder for those people to even afford to live in the city or all that. So that it's kind of an interesting moment for that reason. But I just like, even if I don't get to experience it all the time as much as I might if my life were a little different, I just like living in a place, knowing that in a place like that,
Right.
I do think that there's like a really fascinating, Nashville probably, I would guess, well, I'd be interested to know what you think. I mean, you moved here. Before you moved here, if you just thought, oh, Nashville is like white people and country music and the Southern Baptist Convention, or whatever.
Yeah.
It's probably what I basically thought of Nashville. But I mean, obviously once you get here and you walk around a little bit and you learn, I mean, we're not far from Jefferson Street. You learn about Nashville's African-American history. We have this huge immigrant population, the largest population of Kurdish people outside of Kurdistan. I mean, we have like all this fascinating history and stuff going on here that living here long enough to get to know some of that has also been a real treat, because it's just interesting. I mean, it's much more interesting than I think my idea of Nashville would have been if I didn't live here.
Right. And I think that's it's interesting. I actually, the country music thing for sure as sort of a prominent factor, not necessarily an exclusive factor, but I hadn't necessarily thought about the racial identity of the city, and not until I got here, but until I started to see how Nashville's trying to project itself out into the world, like the quote unquote like new Nashville.
Yeah.
However you feel about it, its projection is white.
Like I think that's right.
People who appear on the sheets developed by the Booster Committee, like wispy blonde ladies in big hats and guys in flannel.
Sure,
You're almost wearing flannel right now.
Yeah.
But, so that's been the interesting thing to reconcile, is less about and I'll admit, and I've said this before, my only understanding of the history of Nashville outside of the Opry is Robert Altman's movie Nashville.
Sure.
So
there are worse things that you could know about Nashville for sure.
Yeah. So
you know what's funny about all that is that I was never into country music, and I've also loved all that. I mean, I don't like a lot of like mainstream country music, but I've gotten way into like I've loved getting to know more about the history of country music and a lot of the sort of, I guess you'd call them like, I mean, Americana is what we call people who don't fit into country right now. So I'm into all that stuff, which doesn't make me like the most unique guy around, but I've gotten it has in a funny way everyone that I knew growing up was like would have laughed at me moving to Nashville. It's like because I never listened to country music, I didn't like that kind of stuff. But it's been fun to get to know that whole. There's a lot of really great history there. And
oh god, yeah.
And
I just bought a ton of like bluegrass. I forget what the actual name of the magazine is, but there's a bluegrass magazine that's been around for like 50 years. Or whatever, and I just bought a ton of issues from the 80s and 90s because like I agree. I just like learning about history through the perspective of like whoever was doing what where.
Oh yeah, it's a blast. I mean, and to be able to go to a place like the Ryman,
right,
and just like sit there and think about who's played there and what's happened there is like that's the best.
After I did an episode about this, but after David Berman died, I read through his blog quite a bit, and I was surprised by how much. His blog's fascinating because 97% he provided no personal context. No, like, I'm posting this because, like, none of it, just his blog. And I was surprised at how much, and this, I think, speaks to just being here for a long time, how much it was just related to country music. Like, it was just, like, a lot of Johnny Paycheck music videos. Like, a lot of, like, posts about, like, not about Jimmy Martin's life, but about Jimmy Martin's, like, estate. Like, just, like, a very strange... But you can't avoid it. It is the culture.
Well, and the
popular culture.
And what's funny, I mean, if we're not careful, we'll be here another hour talking about this, which we could do sometime. But you mentioned the whole new Nashville idea. I mean, what's funny is, it's like Nashville has had these boom years where the city's growing and more people are being interested in it, and GQ wants to write about the city or whatever, and that's all well and good, I guess. But ideally, like, growth and a national spotlight being on your city would bring attention to like all the most interesting things about the city, and I feel like it's been like the opposite. It's like,
right.
And I say this as someone who wrote thousands of words about bachelorette parties in Nashville, so I'm maybe that's like part of the problem, but it's like it is a little weird that in a city that actually has so many like really interesting stories and kind of currents that you could look at, it's like now what we have to show for all this growth and stuff is like there's a hot tub on wheels downtown. It's like it's so strange. It's like, and I mean that's kind of why I love the premise of your podcast, not to blow smoke, but I mean is the idea of just like what's interesting that's going on here that maybe is under the radar a little bit. But yeah, there's so much fascinating stuff, and it unfortunately it seems like rather than getting elevated, a lot of times it's just getting like covered up by the the growth and all that.
That's the thing. I was a columnist for years, and I knew which columns would get read by a lot of people, and I knew which columns would not. Sure. And Nashville Demystified, in one way or another, is a lot of columns that are not going to get read by a lot of people, but the ones who do are into it, right? So, like, I think that's the thing that ends up happening. Is this happened in Portland, Maine? Is once it started to get attention for a particular thing, people manufactured things to get that attention, and that cycle continued. And yeah, I mean, it's. But I think the great thing about here, for sure, is that if you know where to look, which is not very far all the time, because there's a lot of awesome stuff happening, you can find great stuff. Very easily.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Well, thank you just immensely for coming in and
thanks for having me. It's a blast. I really appreciate it.
Next time we will talk only 10% of the time about your day job, and we'll talk about the other things that are happening.
That's a deal. I'll do it.
Awesome.
I'll do it. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Nashville Demystified. Thank you to Jesse LaFontaine for all things related to sound post-production. Each episode has a show-specific illustration provided by my longtime friend Tim Burns. They're pretty great. Check them out on the site and on social and elsewhere. Well, I mean, that's really it. There's no elsewhere in this situation. Follow us on all the places, subscribe, and do all that. Thank you so much for listening to Nashville Demystified. I hope you'll tune in again.